My name is Clara Hawthorne, and for 42 years, my world was a small farmhouse perched on a bluff overlooking the Pacific, just south of a town they call Port Blossom. It was a life measured not in years, but in seasons of the pear orchard my husband, Silas, tended with a devotion that bordered on religious. He believed the land held its own memory, its own quiet wisdom, and for most of our life together, I believed it too. The morning I'm thinking of, the one that set everything in motion, was 6 months after Silas had passed. The fog was rolling in from the ocean, thick and soft as cotton batting, muffling the world in a blanket of gray. It was the kind of morning Silas would have loved. He'd have stood on the porch, a mug of coffee steaming in his hands, and said, "The world's taking a deep breath, Clara. We should too." But Silas wasn't there, and the quiet in the house wasn't peaceful anymore. It was an absence, a hollow note that vibrated in the floorboards and hummed in the window panes. I sat at the kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a mug for something to hold on to, and stared at the manila folder beside me. Inside was Silas's will. Not the formal, notarized document our lawyer, Miss Peterson, had on file, but a version he'd written himself, by hand, in the last weeks of his life. His script, usually so steady and elegant, was a frail, trembling thing, the letters leaning on one another for support. He had made me promise to read this version aloud when our children came home. "I want them to hear it in your voice, Clara," he'd whispered, his own voice thinned by illness. "I want them to have to look at your face when they hear the words." At the time, I thought it was just sentiment. Now, I understood it was a test. They were both coming today. Julian, my son, was flying in from the city, where he worked in finance, a world of sharp angles and sharper numbers that I never quite understood. Audrey, my daughter, was driving up from her minimalist condo a few hours down the coast, where she ran a branding agency that helped companies find their authentic narrative. I'd already heard from both of them, their calls and emails a carefully choreographed dance around the one thing they really wanted to talk about. They never asked how the silence felt, or if I still woke up reaching for Silas's side of the bed. They asked about the status of the estate. They used phrases like asset allocation and legacy strategy. Julian had sent me a preliminary proposal for something he called the Blossom Coast Collective. Audrey had attached a mood board with a color palette she felt honored the regional aesthetic. They weren't coming home to grieve. They were coming home for a board meeting, and I, it seemed, was the primary agenda item. I walked into Silas's study, the one room I hadn't touched. His reading glasses were still on the desk, beside a book of poetry, left open to a page he'd dog-eared. The air was thick with his scent, old books, Earl Grey tea, and the faint, earthy smell of the orchard that always clung to his clothes. I placed the folder on his desk and looked at the empty chair, the leather worn into the shape of him. A quiet thought, sharp as a sliver of glass, surfaced in my mind. Maybe Silas knew they wouldn't listen. Maybe he wrote this last letter not for them, but for me. So I would finally hear myself say the words he knew I already believed. So I would remember the strength he always saw in me, even when I had forgotten it was there. They didn't see me. They saw a gentle, grieving widow. An obstacle to be managed. A signature to be obtained. And the fog outside felt like a fitting curtain, waiting to rise on the final act of a play I never wanted to be in. Audrey arrived first, her electric car gliding silently up the gravel driveway, a stark white pod against the weathered gray of the barn. She stepped out wearing a cream-colored linen suit that was entirely impractical for a place where fog left a damp kiss on everything it touched. Her husband, Evan, remained in the passenger seat, his face illuminated by the blue light of his phone. "Mother," she called, her voice echoing slightly in the damp air. It wasn't a greeting, it was an announcement. She didn't pause on the porch to notice the climbing roses Silas and I had planted on our 10th anniversary, their thorns now bare and glistening with moisture. She walked straight into the kitchen, her expensive leather tote bag landing on the counter with a soft thud. "The damp is just impossible out here, isn't it? We'll need to get some serious dehumidifiers if we're going to make the barn viable for events." She opened the refrigerator, scanned its contents with a critical eye, and decided against whatever she saw. She wasn't visiting home, she was assessing inventory. Julian arrived 3 hours later, not with an apology for his tardiness, but with a gust of city air and the scent of airport coffee. He dropped his briefcase by the door and ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. Traffic was a nightmare, he said, not as an excuse, but as an indictment of a world that dared to inconvenience him. His first question wasn't, "How are you, Mom?" but, "Is the Wi-Fi still as slow as I remember?" They gathered around the oak dining table, the one Silas had built with his own hands, and spread their futures out across its familiar, scarred surface. Julian opened his laptop. Audrey synced her tablet. They had a PowerPoint presentation. Slides filled with pie charts, revenue projections, and architectural renderings of sleek, glass-walled cabins nestled amongst Silas's pear trees. They called it a boutique agritourism experience. Julian spoke of leveraging the property's untapped potential. He explained that by forming a family LLC, they could minimize tax liabilities and attract investors for a multi-phase development. Phase 1 was the cidery and tasting room in the barn. Phase 2 was the construction of 10 luxury eco-pods in the upper orchard. Audrey chimed in with the branding strategy. "We lean into the authenticity, the heritage," she said, her voice smooth and persuasive. "We sell the story of a family legacy, of a connection to the land." People pay a premium for that narrative. They never used Silas's name. They called him Dad, but it sounded like a character in their marketing pitch. They spoke of the orchard not as a living thing that Silas had nurtured for 4 decades, but as a unique selling proposition. They weren't asking for my permission. They were briefing me, managing my expectations. Julian explained that this plan would liberate me from the burden of maintaining the property. It would give me a comfortable, passive income and allow me to move into a nice condo in the city, closer to them. As if the 80 acres of silence and memory I called home were a prison I needed to be freed from. When I finally found my voice and asked about Silas's will, they exchanged a quick, knowing glance. "Of course, we need to honor Dad's wishes," Audrey said, her tone softening into one of gentle condescension. "But we also have a responsibility to be prudent. He would want us to make the smartest decision for the family's future." "Dad was a dreamer, Mom, not a businessman," Julian added, a note of finality in his voice. He slid a document across the table. It was a pre-drafted agreement, a formal transfer of my controlling interest in the property to their new LLC. My name was typed at the bottom, above a neat, dotted line. I stared at the paper, at the space waiting for my signature. They kept talking, their voices a low murmur of strategy and finance, the sound of my life being dismantled and reassembled into something I didn't recognize. I stood up, walked into the living room, and gently closed the French doors behind me. I stood there for a long time, my hand resting on the cool brass handle, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. The fog outside had begun to lift, and a pale, watery sunlight was breaking through. In that moment, the grief that had clouded my thoughts for months began to clear too. I saw them. I saw their plan. And I saw the fundamental mistake they were making. They thought my quiet was emptiness. They believed my sorrow had made me weak. They had no idea what Silas had really left me. It wasn't just a house and an orchard. It was a legacy of patience and a quiet, unshakable resolve they had long since forgotten I possessed. The next morning, the living room felt less like a home and more like a negotiation suite. Julian had moved one of the armchairs to face the sofa, creating a triangle of power. Audrey had lit a scented candle, sandalwood and bergamot, that she said would create a calming atmosphere. It only served to mask the familiar scent of old wood and beeswax, replacing it with something artificial and invasive. I came downstairs carrying the manila folder. Silas's handwritten will was inside, the paper soft and worn at the creases. His signature at the bottom, penned just days before he went into hospice care, was a testament to his final effort. He had been clear. He wanted the assets shared equally between Julian, Audrey, and our late son Daniel's child, my grandson Noah. And he wanted me to read his final words to them myself, in this room, with no lawyers present. He had believed in the power of family, even when evidence suggested otherwise. I stood by the fireplace, the pages trembling slightly in my hands. It wasn't fear. It was the weight of his trust. I cleared my throat to begin. My dearest Clara and my beloved children. Just a second, Mom, Julian cut in, holding up a hand. Before we get into the sentiment, have you had a chance to look over the LLC agreement? There are some time-sensitive considerations. I looked at him, my gaze steady. We will start with your father's will, Julian. As he requested. He leaned back, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes, but he nodded. I started again. I read Silas's opening lines about his love for me, for the life we'd built. Before I could finish the paragraph, Audrey interrupted. His handwriting is a bit shaky here, she said, peering over. Did Miss Peterson review this specific version for legal clarity? Sometimes handwritten codicils can be contested. This is not a codicil, Audrey. This is his letter to us, I said, my voice even. The formal will reflects the same distribution of assets. I continued reading, my voice growing stronger with each word. I reached the part about the orchard, how he hoped it would remain a place of peace for the family for generations to come. Julian stopped me again. Generations to come is a nice thought, but pragmatically, the operating costs on a property this size are significant. Did he allocate a specific fund for upkeep, or is that expected to come out of the general estate, impacting our shares? I didn't answer his question. I just paused, took a breath, and started reading from where I'd left off. They kept on. They questioned the wording of a trust for my grandson, Noah. They asked about capital gains taxes if the property were to be sold. They debated the meaning of the phrase in perpetuity. Audrey wanted to know if his wish for charitable donations could be fulfilled through a corporate sponsorship program under their new brand for the PR benefit. Julian questioned whether Silas was of sound mind when he designated a portion of his life insurance to a local land conservancy, calling it a frivolous expense. They interrupted me 21 times. I counted each one. Not with anger, but with a growing, chilling sense of detachment. Each interruption was a small act of erasure, a deliberate attempt to drown out Silas's voice with their own noise. They weren't listening to his words, they were scanning for loopholes. They weren't hearing his heart, they were assessing his assets. When I finally reached the last sentence, live with kindness and take care of each other, I folded the pages slowly and slipped them back into the folder. The room was silent. Julian was tapping his pen on his knee. Audrey was scrolling through her phone, her expression placid. Well, Julian said, breaking the silence. That was nice. A lot of feeling. But it doesn't change the practical realities. The lawyer will be here tomorrow afternoon, Mom. Maybe we can have her walk you through the financial benefits of our proposal. It really is the most responsible path forward. I nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of what I now fully understood. They would never hear him. They were incapable of it. They had mistaken his gentle spirit for weakness, and now they were making the same mistake with me. That night, after they had gone to bed, I went to the back of the hall closet. Behind a stack of old blankets, I found the small, digital voice recorder Silas used to use for his oral history project, interviewing the old-timers in Port Blossom. The batteries were dead, but I found a fresh pair in the kitchen drawer. I pressed the power button and the small red light blinked to life. I slipped it into the pocket of my cardigan. They thought the reading of the will was over. They thought they had weathered the emotional part and could now get down to business. But I knew the truth. It had only just begun. And this time, I would be the one listening. The next morning, I made Silas's favorite buttermilk pancakes. It felt important to fill the house with a familiar, comforting smell, a small act of defiance against the sterile, corporate scent of Audrey's candle. Julian ate 3 in quick succession, barely tasting them, while reviewing spreadsheets on his laptop. Audrey picked at one, a small frown on her face, and mentioned she was trying to cut out gluten. Neither of them mentioned the will. To them, it was a box that had been ticked. At 2 o'clock sharp, Ms. Peterson arrived. She was a woman in her late 50s with intelligent eyes and a calm, no-nonsense demeanor that I found deeply reassuring. I had switched on the recorder in my pocket the moment I saw her car pull in. I led her to the dining room, where Julian and Audrey were already seated, looking expectant. Miss Peterson opened her briefcase and laid out the official, notarized will. She began by stating, for the record, that Silas's will was legally sound, properly witnessed, and filed with the county. She then proceeded to explain the terms, her voice clear and precise. The house and the 5 acres immediately surrounding it were left to me in full. The remaining 75 acres of the orchard, along with Silas's investment portfolio, were to be placed into an irrevocable trust. The beneficiaries of the trust were Julian, Audrey, and my grandson, Noah, each to receive an equal 1/3 share of the income generated by the trust's assets. An irrevocable trust, she reiterated, looking pointedly at Julian, means the terms cannot be altered, amended, or revoked. Your father was very clear on this point. Julian leaned forward. With all due respect, Ms. Peterson, circumstances change. A trust that locks up the primary asset, the land, in its current, underperforming state isn't fiscally responsible. We've drafted a proposal to form an LLC which would allow us to develop the property and generate significantly higher returns for all beneficiaries. Ms. Peterson didn't flinch. The trust is the will, Mr. Hawthorne. Your father's instructions are to manage the existing assets, not to liquidate or fundamentally change them. The orchard is to be maintained as a working orchard. The investments are to be managed by the appointed trustee. Audrey jumped in, her voice sweet and reasonable. But surely there's some flexibility? What if the beneficiaries are in unanimous agreement? We believe it's what Dad would have wanted if he could see the opportunity before us. The beneficiaries are not in unanimous agreement, I said, my voice quiet but firm. All 3 of them turned to look at me. It was the first time I had spoken. Ms. Peterson continued. Furthermore, your brother Daniel's share is to be managed for your nephew Noah. His legal guardian, Grace, would need to approve any changes. As would the trustee, Mr. Sterling, whose fiduciary duty is to uphold the trust as written, not to maximize profits through high-risk ventures. Julian's jaw tightened. Audrey's polite smile faltered. The air in the room grew tense. Was my mother party to these discussions when the trust was being structured? Julian asked, his tone edged with suspicion. Perhaps she didn't fully grasp the financial implications of locking the land away like this. Before Miss Peterson could answer, I spoke again. Your father and I discussed it at length, Julian. He didn't want his life's work turned into a resort. He wanted it to be a home. A legacy. He trusted me to understand the difference. After Miss Peterson left, a heavy silence descended. Julian stared out the window, his back rigid. Audrey began packing her things with sharp, angry movements. They believed they had hit a wall. They believed the conversation was over. But I knew it was just a pause. Their ambition wouldn't be so easily deterred. That evening, I sat in Silas's study and listened to the recording. I heard their arguments, their dismissive tones, their thinly veiled attempts to paint me as an uninformed, sentimental old woman standing in the way of progress. I saved the file, labeled it with the date, and emailed a copy to myself. Then I uploaded it to a secure online drive. The next day, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Grace, my late son's widow. She lived a quiet life in a small town a few hours north, raising Noah on a teacher's salary. I told her about Julian and Audrey's plan, about the pressure, about the meeting with the lawyer. Then I sent her the audio file. The second call was to Mr. Sterling, the trustee. He was an old friend of Silas's, a retired accountant who valued integrity above all else. I told him the same story and sent him the same file. I didn't have to wait long. Grace called back that evening, her voice shaking with a quiet fury. They have no right, Clara. Daniel loved this place. He would have wanted it protected for his son, not sold off to the highest bidder. You have my full support. Whatever you need. Mr. Sterling emailed me the following morning. His message was brief and to the point. Thank you for this information, Clara. It is now part of the official record for the trust. Any attempt to coerce or unduly influence a beneficiary is a serious matter. I will be issuing a formal letter of advisory to your children, reminding them of their legal and ethical obligations. Please document any further incidents. That afternoon, I saw a strange truck pull into the driveway. A man with a clipboard got out and began walking the perimeter of the barn. Julian met him on the lawn, pointing and gesturing towards the orchard. I walked outside, my heart beating a steady, calm rhythm. Julian, what is this? I asked. Just getting a preliminary assessment from a contractor, he said, not meeting my eye. No harm in gathering data. The discussion is over, I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. Please ask the gentleman to leave. He looked at me then, truly looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He saw not a grieving widow, but the woman who had run this farm alongside his father for 40 years. The woman who knew every inch of this land, every secret it held. He hesitated, then gave the contractor a short, dismissive wave. The man got back in his truck and drove away. That night, I found a new folder on the dining room table, accidentally left behind. Inside were budget projections for their Blossom Coast Collective. Near the bottom was a line item that read, maternal relocation and stipend. Next to it, in Audrey's elegant script, was a note, Phase 3, full buyout/transition to assisted living. I closed the folder and put it back exactly where I found it. I didn't feel anger. I felt a profound, aching sadness, followed by a wave of cold, hard clarity. They weren't just trying to take the land. They were trying to erase me from it. But they had forgotten about Silas's study. They had forgotten about the boxes of old journals, the faded blueprints, the scribbled notes he'd kept for decades. That night, I went looking, and I found it. Tucked away in a folder labeled Someday, I found his real dream. Not a resort, not a cidery. It was a hand-drawn plan for a community garden, a small workshop for teaching at-risk youth woodworking skills, and a partnership with a local veterans group to create a therapeutic horticulture program. At the bottom of the page, in his familiar script, he had written, "The best fruit is the one you share." They thought they knew his legacy. But I was the only one left who held the map. And I was finally ready to follow it. 2 days later, after confirming everything with Mr. Sterling and Grace, I called a meeting of my own. Not with my children, but with a woman named Elena Rossi, the director of a small, local nonprofit called Port Blossom Roots. They focused on vocational training for young people who were struggling to find their way. I had found Silas's notes about them, a newspaper clipping he'd saved. We met at my kitchen table. I didn't have a PowerPoint presentation. I had Silas's worn, hand-drawn sketches and a pot of fresh coffee. I told her his story, the story of the land, and the dream he'd tucked away for someday. I explained the situation with the trust and my legal standing as the owner of the house and the core property. I told her I wanted to make someday happen now. Elena's eyes, warm and discerning, studied the drawings. She traced the lines of the proposed workshop with her finger. She didn't talk about revenue or scalability. She talked about kids who needed a place to belong. She talked about the healing power of working with your hands, of seeing something grow. By the time she left, we had a handshake agreement. I would grant her organization a 99-year lease on the barn and the 10 acres of the upper orchard for the symbolic sum of $1 per year. The lease would be ironclad, legally binding, and effective immediately. Mr. Sterling had already reviewed the draft. Grace had already given her enthusiastic consent via email. That evening, Julian and Audrey cornered me in the living room. Their patience had worn thin. The polite masks had slipped. "Mom, this has gone on long enough," Julian began, his voice tight with frustration. "We've been more than reasonable. We've tried to include you, to make this a collaborative process. But you're being obstructionist. You're letting sentiment cloud good judgment. We've scheduled a call with a potential investor for Friday," Audrey added, her arms crossed. "He's very interested, but he needs to see a unified front. He needs to know we have control of the asset." I let them finish. I waited for the silence to settle in the room, thick and heavy. "There is no asset to control," I said, my voice calm and clear. Julian laughed, a short, humorless bark. "What are you talking about? The land is the asset." "The land is no longer available for your project," I said. "As of this afternoon, the barn and the upper orchard are under a long-term lease to a nonprofit organization. They will be used to create a community program, a place for young people to learn and to heal." The color drained from Audrey's face. Julian stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. You did what? He finally managed to say. I honored your father's final wish, I said, standing up. I walked over to the bookshelf and took down the folder with Silas's sketches. I laid them on the coffee table in front of them. His real wish. Not the one you invented to suit your ambitions. Audrey picked up one of the drawings, her hands trembling slightly. She stared at Silas's handwriting, at the detailed plans for the garden beds and the workshop. You had no right, Julian whispered, his voice raspy. That was our inheritance. Your inheritance is in the trust, Julian, exactly as your father stipulated, I said, my gaze unwavering. You will receive your share of the income as he intended. But this land was never just about money. He left you an opportunity to be part of a legacy of generosity. You saw it as a commodity. I am sorry for you that you couldn't see the difference. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving them with the tangible proof of the man they had so profoundly misunderstood. I went out onto the back porch and closed the door behind me. The cool night air felt clean against my face. The fog was gone, and a million stars were scattered across the black velvet of the sky. The sound of the ocean was a distant, rhythmic sigh. I had not raised my voice. I had not fought them on their terms. I had simply built something new in the space they were trying to demolish. And in the sudden, ringing silence from the house behind me, I felt not triumph, but a deep, quiet peace. Silas's peace. The quiet was finally mine again. The house was empty by morning. They had left in the night without a word. The only sign of their departure was the absence of Audrey's white car and Julian's rental. On the kitchen counter, I found a single sheet of paper torn from a legal pad. We need some space to process your decision, it read. It wasn't signed. I folded the note and put it in a drawer. There was no victory in their leaving, only a vast and sorrowful quiet. The kind of quiet that follows a storm, when the air is washed clean, but the ground is littered with fallen branches. Later that morning, Elena Rossi called. The signed lease had been filed with the county clerk. It was official. The work begins, Clara, she said, her voice filled with a gentle, determined energy. And it did. The following week, the first group of volunteers arrived. They were teenagers from the continuation high school, kids who carried the weight of the world on their stooped shoulders. They were wary, quiet, their eyes guarded. I showed them the barn, dusty and filled with ghosts of Silas's projects. I walked them through the orchard, the trees pruned and patient, waiting for the coming spring. I didn't direct them. I just worked alongside them. We swept out the barn. We mended a section of broken fence. We turned the soil in the patch of land destined to become the garden. For the first few days, we worked in near silence, the only sounds the scrape of shovels and the call of gulls overhead. Then, slowly, a change began. A boy named Mateo, who hadn't said a word for 2 days, asked me if Silas had built the workbench himself. I told him he had, and showed him the small, carved initials on the underside. A girl named Isla, who always wore headphones, took them off to listen as I explained how to graft a new branch onto an old tree. They started to talk to each other, then to me. They started to laugh. They were planting seeds, and in doing so, they were planting new roots for themselves. One afternoon, as I was walking back to the house, I saw a car parked on the coastal highway, just at the edge of the property line. It was Audrey's. She was just sitting there, watching the activity in the orchard. Watching the group of kids gathered around the old workbench, listening as a retired carpenter from town showed them how to measure and cut a piece of wood. I didn't wave. I didn't know what to do. After a few minutes, her car pulled away and disappeared around the bend. That evening I wrote Silas a letter, the first since he passed. I told him about the kids. I told him about the sound of laughter in the barn. I told him his dream was breathing now. I tucked the letter into the box where he kept his most treasured things, a smooth stone from our honeymoon beach, a faded photo of our son Daniel as a little boy, the first pear blossom of every spring. Weeks turned into months. Spring arrived, and the orchard exploded in a riot of white and pink blossoms. The air was thick with the scent of new life. The community garden was flourishing with neat rows of lettuce and peas. The kids had built 2 new benches and placed them at the highest point of the orchard, overlooking the sea. They had sanded and stained them by hand. They had a mural on the side of the barn now, a sprawling, beautiful painting of a pear tree, its roots digging deep into the earth, its branches reaching for the sky. The kids had designed it themselves. I didn't hear from Julian. But one day, a package arrived. Inside was a small, exquisitely crafted set of Japanese pruning shears. There was no note, but the return address was his. I took them out to the orchard and made the first cut on a young tree that needed shaping. The blades were sharp and clean. My life had become quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was full. It was the quiet of shared work, of growing things, of a purpose renewed. It was the peace Silas had always known how to find here. Legacy, I was learning, isn't an asset you own. It's a story you continue. It's the care you tend, the seeds you plant in the lives of others. I often sit on one of the new benches as the sun sets, casting a golden glow over the land. I watch the light filter through the leaves, and I feel him here, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a presence woven into the fabric of this place. He left me a house and an orchard. But he also left me a compass. He trusted me to find the true north of his heart. And in the steady, quiet work of honoring his dream, I found my own way back to myself. I didn't get revenge. I didn't win a battle. I simply chose to nurture life instead of leveraging it. And that, I have come to understand, is the most profound victory of all. If this story has stirred something within you, perhaps a memory of a quiet battle you fought for something you hold dear, take a moment. Breathe in the possibility that your own quiet strength is a force to be reckoned with. You are not alone in tending the gardens others cannot see. Perhaps, like me, you'll find that the most beautiful legacies are the ones that grow in the silence, watered by love and protected by a courage you never knew you had.